and welcome to another edition of Retro RPG Reviews. Sorry about taking so long to get to this one, but it took me a while to zero in on the subject matter for my next video. I had wanted to do Volo's Guide, and then I had a lot of requests for a Pathfinder review, which I've never played, and isn't a retro game, but it's definitely going to happen, and I can say for certain it will be the follow-up video after this one. This video, however, will explore what has been traditionally referred to as the basic D&D game, or original Dungeons & Dragons. This game reached its zenith with the publication of the Rules Cyclopedia in 1991, so I'm going to talk about the game's history, why it came about, discuss also the Gazetteer expansions, and the review of the Rules Cyclopedia itself. I wanted to give this classic game the treatment and overview it deserves, which is why I've decided to break the video down into 3 parts. Part 1 will be about the history of the game and how it came to be. Part 2 will be about the known world expansions or Gazetteers. And Part 3 will be about the Rules Cyclopedia itself. So, let's get started, shall we? The origins of the basic set of Dungeons & Dragons came about as TSR reorganized and transitioned its rule set from the original white box set to the advanced D&D game. The white box is a classic in itself, in that it innovated an entirely new type of game and entertainment. But as a rule set, it was atrocious, and very difficult to understand even for experienced wargamers, much less the novice. Thus was created the blue box set of basic D&D. This was a standalone product, and it was intended that players would transition from this game to the advanced D&D game. The revision and reorganization was done by Professor Eric Holmes and contains a lot of material from the white box set and a bit from the Greyhawk expansion. There really is not a lot going for this rule set. It's a bit minimal. For example, there is no distinction for weapon damage. It's all D6s. The only ability scores that give bonuses are Constitution and Dexterity, while other abilities giving a bonus to experience for high prerequisites such as Strength for fighters or Wisdom for clerics. It takes characters from levels 1 to 3. While this revision is a major step forward in rules clarity from the original box set, it still leaves a lot to be desired. The artwork is amateurish at best, but there are naked harpy boobies. Yay! This set actually uses the AD&D style alignment system. No explanation is really given, just this spiffy graphic, which is pretty explanatory. But for me, the highlight of the thing, and what makes it worth picking up, is the dungeon module in the back, the Ruins of Xenopus. This is the undisputed sample dungeon champion of the universe. It's got a magic sundial, a trick statue, skeletons in niches, ridiculously massive rooms, rat tunnels, catacombs, an underground river, a sea cave full of pirates, a damsel in distress, and to top it all off, an evil Thermitage with an enraged pet gorilla. Guys, how awesome is that? This edition includes all the rules needed to play, monsters, and a Dungeon Master section. Now, some versions came with the adventure module B1 in Search of the Unknown, while others came with Dungeon Geomorphs and the Monster and Treasure Assortment supplements. Personally, in my opinion, the B1 module is superior in that it gives a nice basic outline of the adventure, but leaves many rooms undetailed for the DM to fill in. Thus, different groups would have a different experience depending on the whims of the DM. It is also quite clear from reading these rules that this box set was meant to be a gateway to advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Throughout the rule set, it says, for more detail, please see the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rules. This rule set remained in print until 1979 and is one of TSR's best sellers at that point. Now, here is where something interesting happened, and to understand it, you really have to go back to the origins of the game and its progression. D&D itself came from a rule set originally written by Jeff Perrin called Chainmail. This was a medieval wargame rule set that Jeff wrote for his gaming group. In a game like this, the scale was frequently 1 to 10 or 1 to 20, with one miniature representing a particular number of men, and played out on a sand table. Gary Gygax expanded upon this rule set by adding an option for a fantasy element. spells, fantastic creatures like orcs and dragons. And, in addition, Gygax added a neat little section at the end, almost as an afterthought for man-to-man combat or one-on-one combat. Thus, the miniature scale here would be 1 miniature to 1 man, for things like jousting tournaments and so forth. Then, Dave Arneson got a hold of the Chainmail rules that Gygax had tweaked, and tweaked them again for his own Twin Cities Wargaming Club. And here you can see the inspiration from Chainmail Dave used to create his own one-on-one combat table. Dave created the Blackmore campaign, not for large-scale miniature battles, but for groups of one-on-one combat, and not using sand tables either. Here, miniatures weren't even required. The events were mapped out on graph paper, with Dave having the complete map, which is slowly revealed to the players as they progress. Dave's contribution to what a role-playing game is can't be understated. Concepts such as character class, level progression, hit points were all Dave's innovations. However, it was Gygax who believed in the game itself as having a wider appeal than hardcore wargamers. In my mind, this is the fundamental schism between Gygax and Arneson. Dave was an outstanding creative force, but Gygax was an organizer and willing to risk everything on the concepts that Dave had created. The fact is that without both of their contributions, there would be no Dungeons & Dragons. Later, Gygax would take his own experiences, the mirrored rules from the original D&D game, and revamp them into a more cohesive and complex game called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Up to this point, Arneson had been getting a royalty check for anything with the D&D name on it. TSR considered Advanced Dungeons & Dragons to be a completely different game and had no intention of paying Arneson royalties for AD&D material. This is when Arneson filed the first of a series of 5 lawsuits. Ultimately, Arneson was entitled to anything D&D related, but AD&D was indeed a separate game. TSR agreed to continue to print an original version of Dungeons & Dragons. And thus, for the next 20 years, 2 games named Dungeons & Dragons would develop in parallel, each very similar, but also quite different. It also might be interesting to note that while AD&D went through many expansions and revisions in its rule set, including 2 editions of the game, the rules for Dungeons & Dragons, the original Dungeons & Dragons, remained relatively unchanged during its entire run. Some of the biggest differences between D&D and AD&D were that D&D characters tended to have fewer abilities than AD&D characters of similar level. Races such as elves, dwarves, and halflings were actually character classes unto themselves, and combat rounds were 10 seconds long with D&D rather than the ridiculous 1-minute rounds with AD&D. In 1981, the basic game was revised once more, and this time by Tom Moldavay, and artwork was done by Earl Otis and Jeff D. This work was significantly more comprehensive and detailed than the Holmes version, but easier to understand, yet still less detailed than Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. But still, taking players from the first level of experience to the third level of play. Gone were notes referring the player to AD&D, but referring the player to the expert set, which was released around the same time. Also included in the set was the Gygax written module Keep on the Borderlands, which introduced a whole generation of gamers to the Dungeons & Dragons game. The expert set took the players from the 4th to the 14th level of play. These 2 rule sets drew directly from the original white box sets, with the major difference between the 2 games being that races were a character class. In addition, unlike AD&D combat rounds were a mere 10 seconds long. Moldavay also introduced the concept of a morale roll for monsters. In fact, basic D&D would have many interesting rules that AD&D didn't have as the various box sets were introduced. The expert set refers players to the companion set, where rules were for characters from the 15th to the 25th level of play, with level of play being regulated all the way up to 36 levels. Unfortunately, it would be another 3 years before this release would be seen when the companion set was released in 1984. But before then, the basic rules would see yet another revision. In 1983, the basic rules were revised again, this time by Frank Mentzer. While functionally identical to the Moldvay set in most respects, this was yet another reorganization of the rules with an eye towards ease of play and an upgrade on graphics and design, with artwork now by Larry Elmore and Jeff Easley. As previously, the expert rules were released around the same time, which took the character to the 14th level of play. A year later, the companion rules were released, not only detailing character progression for 15th to the 25th level of play, but providing detail on character strongholds and how DMs can create interesting adventures for characters of this high level. Great detail was gone into the development of a feudal-type system for a fantasy world with the Dominion rules. Also included in this set were rules for a mass combat game called The War Machine. This set also details ways for demi-human characters to improve their combat ability via attack ranks with additional experience, even though their levels are capped about this level. Also, more great work by Larry Elmore. Now, I want to say that it is important to note that TSR really had developed an interesting fantasy RPG that was quite distinctive in flavor and rules from its AD&D counterpart, and in my mind, better in many respects. I loved the Dominion rules, and it was obvious that this set was intended to be taken as a whole rule system, even though released in individual box sets. Clearly, the DM would have his world design firmly in place by the time the players reached 15th level. Thus, at low levels, it would be important for a DM to have this rule set. A year later, TSR would release yet another box set of rules for the D&D game called the Master Rules Set. This set detailed character levels from 26 to 36, with 36 being the highest level achievable. And here we have another distinction between AD&D and D&D. An actual upper limit was placed on the levels. The Master Set is really something special. Here, the treatment of weapons is really far more distinctive and complex than even AD&D, with the introduction of the Weapons Mastery rules. Here, players could progress with individual weapons from novice to grandmaster. Each weapon thus far introduced to the game was given individual treatment, considering things like handedness, skill level, defense bonuses, training, and detailed individual descriptions and rules for each weapon. While this may seem a bit unwieldy, the system actually integrated quite smoothly into the existing D&D game and really served to further elevate the game to something more than just basic D&D. In addition to these rules, the Master Set also introduced the Paragon Paths, or Paths to Immortality. The details of these rules allowed for epic quests whereby players could actually achieve the power of the immortals. Unlike AD&D that had deities, D&D gods were called immortals, so it is actually possible for players to quest to achieve this level of power. At this point, in my opinion, the D&D game was actually superior in many ways to its AD&D counterpart. The length of combat rounds, the weapon details, the treatment of the various power levels of characters, and how to run them made for a really interesting and fun role-playing game. Unfortunately, TSR really never promoted this game like it did its flagship AD&D, and I think that suffered. But even with all of that, TSR was not yet finished with its rules set. The following year, the Immortal set of rules was released, and that detailed rules for playing the very gods of the universe. Now, to me, this is a distinctly different type of game altogether and beyond the realm of medieval fantasy. So I won't really go into detail, but it was there for the players that wanted it. It was a way for your players to continue even after they achieved the most wonderful, achievable thing a character could hope for, which was immortality and godhood, basically. And I want to say just how great a set these rules are, and it was getting better all the time, because from 1987 to 1990, TSR would release the much acclaimed Gazetteer series of game supplements detailing the known world, originally introduced in the Expert Adventure module X1 Isle of Dread, from the Grand Duchy of Karamakos to the Hollow World. This series would add new rules such as skills and new character classes for the various demi-human races such as elves, dwarves, and halfling. It would win award after award and innovate D&D in ways never explored in cosmology, background, and gameplay. But more on that series in my next video. Part 2, The World of Mystara. Everyone, thank you so much for watching my videos. I did want to note that we've hit 100 subscribers. Thank you so much for that. Please feel free to share this video, to comment, and suggest other retro games that you would like to see me review. After this video series, I fully intend to delve into Pathfinder role-playing game, which I've not played, but of course I played a lot of 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons, and I'm going to try to play a game or two of Pathfinder before I actually do the review. So many things are happening here, and I've got a lot of great reviews coming up, so I'm also looking forward to the release of D&D Next, which is just around the corner with an August release date of August 2014 release date. So that's coming up. So a lot of great things for us gamers, a lot of things to discuss and review. So until next time, as always everyone, game on.